And so I'm not going to talk about conscious capitalism, actually. I'm going to talk about something a little more personal and a little deeper. As you start to think about the expanse of your life and all the things that we've experienced, and you say, at the end, what is it going to amount to? Right? And what kind of legacy are we creating through this? And that's a function of how we choose to live our lives. We're all given life, but we actually have to consciously choose what we're going to do with that life and how we're going to live that. So I'm going to leave you with some question at the end, which I think will get you thinking. So why are we here? I think we're here to reduce suffering in the world, to bring more joy in the world, to evolve ourselves. As Richard Leider said, the default human purpose is to grow and to give. And how are you going to grow into what? You're going to grow. Each of us has a unique destiny. And in what ways are we going to contribute to the flourishing of this world? And as the Dalai Lama said, our prime purpose in life is to help others. And if you can't help them, at least don't hurt them. But the sad reality, I think, is that most of us are out there creating suffering in the world. I would say that the vast majority of human suffering on this planet is caused by humans towards other humans and towards our planet and towards other life. And if you look at leaders, the leaders who are unhealed within are the ones who create suffering on a mass scale. So this is actually a shot of Auschwitz and Auschwitz survivors sitting in the front, right? And that's a sort of a monument to that idea that unhealed leaders can cause so much harm and suffering in every sphere. It doesn't have to be at that level. It can be in an organization. It can even be in a family system. The unhealed wounds of the leader are going to show up not only in their lives, but in the lives of everybody that they touch. So this is the new book that Lakshmi was mentioning that Nilima Bhatt, my co-author on a book called Shakti Leadership. I'm a huge believer in everything that you're doing and then what you said. This is a book that we just finished. We just sent it in. It's about healing leaders. And it has two meanings. It's about healing the leader. We all carry wounds and traumas. We're all living with post-traumatic stress injury. We may not have PTSD, but being human itself is traumatic in many ways. And it's also about becoming a healing leader in the world. And these are 7 steps that came to me in a silent retreat in upstate New York, run by the Brahma Kumaris. Actually, it's called Peace Village. And I was there with about 35 people, Peter Senge and David Cooper-Ryder and others. And in those days of silence, these messages came to me. I had 42 pages of notes by the end of those 3 days. And I got these steps, which I've heard about many of them. Everybody talks about you have to know yourself, etc. So it starts with knowing yourself. But that's a really deep question. It can take a long time for us to truly discover what is it that makes me who I am and unique from the estimated 117 billion humans who have occupied this planet today and in the past. So how do I get to know myself, my true nature, my swabhav, right? What makes me unique and distinct? And then I have to love myself. That is not automatic. Bruce Lipton estimates that 80 to 90% of people do not love themselves. Many people have a deep level of self-loathing. I know that I lived for about 40 years at least with this very negative view of myself because everything that was natural to me that defined me was seen as weaknesses by my father. He said, you're too trusting, couldn't trust anybody. You're too idealistic, you need to be only pragmatic. You're too peace-loving, you need to be rough and tough. And you get good grades in school, but that doesn't matter. You need to be street smart. So I got this sense that, oh my God, I'm just defective, right? So it takes a long time to overcome that programming. As we say, as a parent, you have to be very careful what you say to your kids because your outer voice to them becomes their inner voice for the rest of their life. And it takes a lot of work to overcome that programming. And so getting to that place of loving myself, not only self-acceptance, but self-compassion, self-forgiveness, and ultimately self-love. Because you didn't make yourself. You're a gift to yourself. You received this as a gift. Be yourself. Your job is to live into that being, right? Be as fully manifested in yourself as you can be. Cultivate that state of presence. Choose yourself. I was living with a victim mentality. Why did I have this kind of father? I was born into this very feudal, misogynistic, Rajput culture in Madhya Pradesh. And I used to think, why are my friends' fathers are so kind and loving, and how come I'm born in this environment, right? So I was kind of in that victim mentality. But then ultimately I realized I had to experience all of that abuse in that patriarchal feudal system so that 55 years later I would write a book about the feminine. And if I didn't do that, that was part of my journey in this life, to bring that. As my coach told me 5 years ago, that you've been honoring your mother with your work the last 15 years. You spent 45 years trying to impress your father, the first 45 years of my life, but then I finally discovered my path. Conscious capitalism, everything is bringing that feminine energy, love, caring, compassion, empathy, inclusion into a world that needs it so deeply. We're completely dominated by masculine energy in the world of business, politics, everything. So we have to choose your past, choose your present, live in gratitude, choose your future, embrace your hero's journey, right? Overcome those challenges. The cave that you fear to enter holds the treasure that you seek, in Joseph Campbell's words. So you have to embrace that and then express yourself. Find that purpose. Why am I here? What am I supposed to be doing with this life? And choosing growth over safety. If we always choose safety, we will never grow. And complete yourself, which is the integration of masculine and feminine energy within all of us. As Carl Jung said, every man has an inner woman, every woman has an inner man. We have the symbol of the Ardhanareshwar that shows us that our journey is towards wholeness. We may be born with genders, and we go beyond that to include the elder and the child as well. The elder energy, the wise, higher self, right? And then the child. Within you, if you have a healed child, you have access to joy and play and laughter and creativity and innovation all come from that. So the summary phrase that Nilima came up with is the wise fool of tough love. Each of us can become our own versions of the wise fool of tough love. The wisdom of the elder, the playfulness and joy of the child, the toughness of the masculine, the unconditional love of the feminine. And then the last step is heal yourself. We all carry these wounds and traumas. So it's about healing our body, but more importantly, healing our wounds and traumas. As I said, it's a universal state that people have trauma in their life. Most of us do not acknowledge it, or we minimize it. We said, I didn't go to Afghanistan and I didn't go to Iraq and I didn't face horrendous situations like other humans have. And therefore, what right do I have to complain about the things that happen in my life? But the fact is, life is hard. Things happen to each and every one of us. And most of us deny them or minimize them. And therefore, we never heal them. And therefore, we live our lives in a reactive mode. And we are not in charge of our own words and actions. And we inflict suffering on ourselves and others. So healing ourselves is a paramount duty that we have to ourselves and to the people that we love and lead. So that's what the new book is about. And ultimately, it is about, as I said, healing leaders and healing all of us. And so if you look at the impact, what happens when leaders actually are healed? And nobody is fully healed ever. But if you look at some leaders that I consider to be whole human beings and they don't have manifested trauma, Herb Kelleher, the CEO of Southwest Airlines, the most beloved and successful airline, his phrase, the business of business is people, yesterday, today, and forever. Okay? And that embodied the culture there, made them the most successful airline. Their stock market symbol is love, LUV. Ratan Tata, I think we all know about the Tata Way, the history of the Tatas. Ratan Tata himself, what happened after the terrorist incidents in 2008. We had our first Conscious Capitalism conference in that ballroom, the first event that happened after that massacre. And the way the Tatas responded with such love towards those people who did the extraordinary sacrifices, stood in front of guests to take bullets, right? So many died in that process. Nobody ran away from that hotel. And what the outpouring of love that came back from the Tatas towards those people, paying their full salary for the rest of their life, taking care of the education of their children all the way through graduate school, anywhere in the world, providing healthcare, forgiving house loans, car loans. And then when the plan was brought to Ratan, he didn't say how much is it going to cost and are we legally obligated to do all this. He just said, are we doing enough? There must be something more. Because we cannot possibly make up for what was done. Satya Nadella at Microsoft is taking this entrenched, abusive, sort of arrogant culture that existed in Microsoft, completely transformed it. And he has been on his own healing journey. He has a special needs son who just died recently. He's got other challenges. He learned a great deal of his wisdom from his mother. And he's bringing that and he's healing himself and he's healing that organization. And Microsoft has become the second most valuable company in the world after people thought that Microsoft is an old story, doesn't matter anymore. And he has completely transformed and he's brought empathy into that culture. You would never put those two words, Microsoft and empathy, in the same sentence, but he has completely transformed them. So it shows the power of a healing and healed leader. John Mackey is the CEO of Whole Foods, and he and I co-started the Conscious Capitalism movement, along with Shubhro Sen, by the way, who's here, who used to run the Tata Management Training Center. And John refers to Whole Foods as his ashram. Think about that. He said, my work, Whole Foods is where I do my deepest spiritual work. This is where I grow the most. Right? And it can be a place of growth and healing for everybody connected to that. And he said, every time I get stuck, Whole Foods gets stuck. If I get stuck at a certain level of consciousness, the company cannot break through. And therefore, I have to keep working on myself to elevate my consciousness. And that's the journey I think all of us can and should be on. This is Bob Chapman, with whom I wrote a book called Everybody Matters, and one of the most inspiring leaders I've seen. Now, Bob was a accounting undergrad and MBA from Michigan. He was running his company that he inherited from his father in a very traditional MBA way, right? Focusing on the numbers, seeing everything through the lens of numbers, firing people, whatever he had to do. But then he had these awakenings and epiphanies, including at a church. His friend's daughter was getting married, and he had the thought, oh my God, this is his precious child and he wants the best for her. He said, everybody who works in our company is somebody's precious child. Why would I not make sure that she is safe and growing and happy, right? Why would I do that for my daughter but not for your daughter? So that became a mantra in the company and completely transformed the organization. Not only his company, then he started acquiring companies, because there are plenty of small manufacturing businesses in the US, like Barry Wehmiller, his company, which were all struggling. They couldn't compete with Brazil and China and Mexico, right? People thought America is out of that game. And he said, no, we're going to compete right here. We're going to pay people well and treat them superbly and bring back manufacturing from Brazil and China back to Wisconsin and Ohio and all of these other little towns. And he started perfecting that formula by putting people at the center, right? And empowering them and treating them with love and respect and dignity. And he has now bought 140 companies, struggling, dying businesses, and for the most part, turned them all around. Never sold a single one. He said, I don't buy companies, I adopt them. It's like adopting a child. When there's a recession, you don't say to 2 of your 5 children, sorry, you're redundant. We can't have so many children. Now you're out. So once you're in the family, you're in the family. And I was with Bob some years after we wrote the book, and I just said, how are you doing? He said, I'm off to Europe tomorrow morning. We're looking at 5 acquisitions in Europe. And this year, I think we're going to buy 10 or 12 more companies. I said, Bob, you already have 85 companies at that time, and you've got 26 grandchildren and children. And he's got all these beautiful homes and private gym. He's got a beautiful life. I said, why aren't you just enjoying your life? Why are you running around like crazy at the age of 76? Now he's 78, 79, I think. I said, when the number of companies exceeds the number of children and grandchildren, maybe you have enough. And his answer to me was, Raj, I don't know how much time I have left. And on my deathbed, I will not be proud of the machines we built or the money we made. I will be proud of the lives we touched. And before I die, I want to touch as many lives as possible. And I said, Bob, you're not growing a business, you are spreading a healing ministry. When Barry Wehmiller grows, people's lives get better. They have a future. Their children have a future. When he buys a company that employs 600 people in a town of 1,400, that whole town would die if that company dies. And now that town has a future, those people have a future. So he's spreading a healing ministry. Now, the opposite of that, which is what we see in the world of business, is really left over from the days of empire building, right? You had Alexander the Great and this the Great, and all the people with great after them, you know that they cause the most suffering. In order to fill their own ego, and they can never have an empire big enough, and hundreds of millions of people have to die to fill that hole that will never be filled by anything, and then they die and the empire falls apart. And this is what we see in the world of business. There's a company called 3G Capital out of Brazil that basically buys companies, and the first thing, 40% of people lose their jobs. Everybody else is on strict cost cutting and EBITDA goals, and if you don't do it, you're fired. Heart attacks go up, stress goes up, burnout goes up. I mean, it's just, life gets pretty grim. But this is why, because the 3 guys, they're worth anywhere from $12 to $20 billion each, the 3 founders, and it's never enough, right? So they keep having to buy more companies and decimating their cultures and destroying the lives of those people. So you can choose to either be in that mode, growing through as a predatory empire in the world of business, or you can be spreading our healing ministry. When you have a company that creates healing in the world, reduces suffering, and brings more joy, you have, as Bob does, an obligation to grow. It's not a compulsion to grow, it's an obligation to grow. Because compulsive growth, that we have to grow 10%, 12% and create more wealth, that creates suffering. But when you have a conscious growth, obligation to grow, you want to spread this business not for your own ego or your own wallet, but because it improves the lives of people in the world. And therefore you work 18 hours a day and out of your mind, because you're doing healing work in the world. And that's what ultimately became the inspiration for that idea of healing, business as healing. And we have about 25 stories of companies, including Jaipur Rugs, by the way. I see that N.K. Chaudhary is speaking, I think, tomorrow in Mysore as part of this, right? I think that's very important. We have to reduce suffering and bring more joy. And how do you do that? When I started writing that book, in the US, when you order Chinese food, you get a fortune cookie. And this is what the cookie said. There are many ways that you can be hurtful, but only one way to heal, and that is through love. And that is ultimately the answer. Money cannot buy happiness, and money cannot buy love. This is a wonderful movie that drives home that lesson. J. Paul Getty, the richest man in the world in the 1970s, the most miserable man in the world, right? So money cannot buy love and it cannot buy happiness. Okay, it's about manifesting that. So the last question I want to leave you with, Who will show up when we die? Who will show up in your funeral and with what energy? This is the CEO who's passed away a few years ago of a company, of a bank, the leading bank in Panama, Banco General. I was there a couple of months ago, and his son now runs the company. But we heard about this legendary leader who's just so beloved. And thousands of employees of the bank, if you look at their WhatsApp, it's a picture of them and him. All over there, people celebrating this man's life, how loving he was towards everybody. When his funeral happened, they could not find a venue big enough to hold the 5, 7, 8,000 people who wanted to be there in person. And the priest who was delivering the eulogy, the priest himself was crying at his funeral. Okay, you don't see a priest cry, okay, at the funeral very often. But the outpouring of love was extraordinary. And if I think about my own life, my grandfather, who was the Thakur of our village, right? Incredibly hardworking. He had tremendous positional power as the Thakur, inherited title and all of that. Incredible work ethic, but he was incredibly harsh and dictatorial. Nobody could live their life. Under that regime, it's like you couldn't breathe. You had no freedom. Even as a 50, 60-year-old son, you still did not have the freedom that you wanted. And so when he died, not only was there no grief, people were actually waiting for him to die because they wanted to inherit the land and get their title and all of that kind of stuff. My father was a brilliant scientist, very charismatic human being, but his love was entirely conditional. If I did something like I said, I want to marry somebody which out of our Rajput culture, I met somebody in the US, he cut me off for 5 years. He said, you must choose between her or us. Have no contact with me. He said, I curse your marriage. Right? I mean, it's that love is only conditional, which means it's not real love. Right? It's as long as you follow what I tell you. My mother was pure unconditional love. There's nothing I could do that would diminish that. However, she never stood in her power. She had this innate power coming from that love, but she never realized it. And she just thought she was there to take care of us. And when I finally told her, after my coach sort of made sense of my life, said, you've been honoring your mother. When I called her and told her that, she said, Raj, I'm nothing. I'm nothing. No, I said, you're everything. Without you, I don't know if I would be here. And certainly I would not, my life would not have mattered, without her model. So the question I want to leave you with is this: what will your legacy be as a leader and as a human? When you die, or even when you leave your job as a CEO, let us say, right? What's going to be the predominant energy in the room? Will there be grief or will there be relief? When my father died, nobody cried. I wanted to cry, but I couldn't. The only person who cried at my father's funeral was my mother. 4 months later, my mother died. Nobody could stop crying. And every time we think about her, I was in the plane and Apple suddenly shared memories of Mummy, just started showing me pictures of my mother, and I'm crying in the plane, 5, 6 years later. So again, what is our legacy? At the end of life, if all people feel is relief, or if they feel indifferent, versus they feel deeply grateful that you're here, and a tremendous sense of grief over that. And I think, to me, my journey, and perhaps for many of us, is we don't have to choose. I can either be like my father with tremendous charisma and personal power, or I can be all about love. We need to be both. As Martin Luther King said, we must be tough-minded and tender-hearted. And if we can do both of those things, then I think we have the full impact that we're capable of having as human beings in this life. Thank you very much.